Welcome, class. This is Chapter 8.1, The High Middle Ages. During the early Middle Ages, European monarchs had limited power. However, from 1000 to 1300, their power increased, and they were able to control and establish foundations for modern government. In 1066, which is an important date, by the way, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, William the Conqueror took over England, and by 1086, he had completed a census of the property survey, which he called the Domesday Book. It helped him to establish an effective taxation system and keep track of the things that were in his kingdom. In 1154, Henry II ascended to the English throne. He expanded the justice system. The royal court decisions became the foundation for the English common law. That is a system on custom and prior rulings. Henry II also set up a jury system that was the forerunner of today's grand jury. Henry's son, King John, abused his power and was forced to sign the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. It required the king to obey the laws, and it also established two important principles. Number one, due process of law, or the protection from arrest without proper legal procedures. And number two, habeas corpus, which means the protection from imprisonment without being charged of a crime. John also agreed not to raise taxes before consulting the Great Council of Lords and Clergy. Under later rulers, this council would evolve into the English Parliament, which is its legislature. Parliament eventually controlled the power of the purse, which means that it would not approve new taxes unless the monarch met certain demands. Unlike the English, the early French monarchs did not rule a united kingdom. Then, in 987, Hugh Capet became king and began expanding the royal power. The Capetians stabilized the kingdom over the next 300 years. In 1179, Philip II took the throne, and he gained control of English lands in Normandy and expanded territories in southern France, adding vast areas to his domain and becoming Europe's most powerful ruler. Louis IX came to power in 1226, and although he persecuted heretics and Jews and led a crusade against the Muslims, he also outlawed private wars, ended serfdom, and expanded the royal courts. So by the time of his death in 1270, France was a centralized monarchy, ruling over a unified state. In 1302, the Estates Generales was set up, and this was a council of clergy, noblemen, and townspeople, but it never gained the power of the purse. And so the Estates Generales never developed into the system of government that the English Parliament did. It never had any authority over the French royalty. In the early Middle Ages, between 400 and 1000 AD, the monarchs were close in power to the other feudal lords. Usually they were chosen because they were not as strong as the other lords of that area, and so they had to struggle with the other feudal lords in order to gain enough power to rule as a king. And the church operated outside of their control altogether. So these three factions during the early Middle Ages were continually struggling for power. But between 1000 and 1300, the monarchs rose above the other power factions, and they did this in four different ways. The first way was that they developed a new royal justice system. In the past, the church had its own separate judicial system operating under something called the canon law, and this law would apply to priests and other church workers, and it did not necessarily apply to the secular world. But the secular world was divided also. Each feudal lord had his own system of justice, and the king's laws were not necessarily obeyed within the feudal lord's domains. So after 1000, the monarchs started to push for more of a unified law system that included anyone living within his domain. The second thing that they did to try to increase their power was to develop a more accurate taxing system. And for this, they needed more accurate records. And for more accurate records, they needed a more educated tax collector to go around and make sure that all the records were correct. So after 1000, we see more accurate records being taken. Thirdly, they began to create larger standing armies that could put noble lords in their place and maintain peace within their country and also along the borders between other countries. And fourthly, they strengthened the ties with the middle class. In order to defeat their noble lords, they needed to have an ally, and usually the ally was the middle class, who also saw the noble lords as a threat to their survival and thriving. So these four things helped the monarchs to develop more power. When the Romans pulled out of England in about 400 AD, there was a vacuum left behind. The peoples who had been living there under the Roman rule were known as the Britons, and they had grown kind of soft under the Roman rule. And so a new people group called the Angles and the Saxons, and also the Jutes, took advantage of the situation and moved across the English Channel into the fairly unprotected British Isles. And these peoples formed a new society in England, and we know that society for being the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons had a series of kings, and in 1066, the final Anglo-Saxon king, named Edward, died childless. He was an interesting fellow. He had grown up with a very strict mother, who and also a church that was very strong, and they had taught that he had a very strong conscience, and he had done a lot of bad things. To be a king, you have to take life a lot, and he felt very guilty for that. So he often would wear a hair shirt under his armor or under his everyday clothes in order to create discomfort, and he felt that this discomfort would help him to do penance for all the sin that he had committed. Well, he also, part of his penance was that he never had children, and when he did get married, but he never consummated that marriage, and so his childlessness ended up becoming quite a problem. When he died, there was no heir to the throne, and his father-in-law decided to take advantage of, his brother-in-law decided to take advantage. His brother-in-law's name was Harold Hardrada, and Harold Hardrada felt that it was his right to take over the throne because of his close association. Well, Harold had a lot of fires to put out when he first came to the throne. His younger brother had felt disgruntled over past wrongs and had helped to lead a group of Vikings or Danes to attack northern England. And so Harold got his troops together and rode up towards northern England to defeat his younger brother. When he had finished doing that, he got word that another attack was being done in the southern part of England by one of his longtime enemies, a man named William, Duke of Normandy, also known as William the Bastard because he was actually married, his father was never married to his mother. But this sobriquet was eventually done away with a much better nickname known as William the Conqueror. So you can guess what the final of this story is. But Harold took all of his very tired troops and marched them very quickly down towards southern England to address the next problem, which was William's attack in the south of England. Well, William had come prepared. He had been planning this invasion for quite some time. He created a kind of prefab fort that he had brought over in his ships, and when he landed on the shores, he quickly put up the fort in preparation for Harold's arrival. Well, it took Harold a little bit of time to get there, but when he did, he foolishly did not take the time to really rest or recuperate, and his troops were extremely tired, but he decided to attack them right away because William was doing things to make himself a nuisance. He was attacking surrounding lands and taking whatever he wanted, ruining the crops that they had been working on all year long. So this was the perfect time for raiding, by the way, because the crops were ready to be taken in. So Harold decides to attack and stop the destruction, and instead Harold is killed on the battlefield. In fact, he's maimed so badly that they can't actually identify his body until his special friend, his girlfriend, comes along and is able to identify his body. He was also shot through the eye, which was probably what killed him. So this famous battle is commemorated on a tapestry called the Bayeux Tapestry, and this picture shows the troops that had come in. These are the Normans, and they have the characteristic peaked helmet. They had metal helmets on, and it shows the Normans conquering the Saxons, and it also changed the course of English history. So the Saxons became the subjugated peoples, and the Normans became the rulers. During the early Middle Ages, political authority was extremely decentralized. There existed many layers of authority, such as earls, counts, barons, knights, that existed between the king and the ordinary people. But the rulers of England and France and Germany, which were the three main territories which developed the idea of a centralized kingship, although Germany never completely developed into that, these rulers wanted to strengthen and extend the royal authority within their territories. They wanted to establish effective means of communication with all peoples in order to increase the public order. They also wanted to increase their revenue, so they needed efficient bureaucracies, and they wanted to find solutions to these problems, and the solutions that they found ended up laying the foundations for our modern nation states. Nation states are generally defined by geographic boundaries. They usually have bodies of law and institutions of government. The states claim to govern according to law, and a modern nation state depends on the loyalty of the majority of its citizens. In return, those citizens expect the state to provide order for their daily work and other activities, protection of their property rights, and the states work to apprehend and punish those that violate those rights. Nation states should supply currency or some kind of medium of exchange so that the people can have regulated ways of trade, and also the nation state should have a relationship with other foreign governments. So these these ideals of a nation state were actually founded during the Middle Ages, during this time period. England had somewhat of a head start over the other European countries because the Danes who invaded, or the Vikings who invaded England in the 900s, had a much more centralized version of government than the other Germanic states that had settled on the mainland. So the Anglo-Saxon kings in England date back much farther than any other kings. And the Danish king Canute, who ruled from 1016 to 1035, and his successor, Edward the Confessor, who ruled from 1042 to 1066, were recognized by the others as being the overall rulers of the kingdom of England. The reason why England was so much better off was that its geographic boundaries were so clear and so defined. And I think that's one of the reasons why England developed a kingship much more quickly. In 1128, William's granddaughter, Matilda, married Geoffrey of Anjou, and their son was known as Henry II. He inherited the French provinces of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and all in the northwestern part of France. And when Henry grew up, he married the great heiress Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152. And so he claimed the lordship over Aquitaine, Poitou, and Gascony, all in the southern part of France. The histories of England and France were thus very greatly entwined, and so this is going to cause a lot of problems later on. When Edward the Confessor died, his cousin, Duke of William of Normandy, known in English histories as William the Conqueror, claimed the English throne, and in 1066 he defeated the Anglo-Saxon claimant on the battlefield and in Hastings. As William subdued the rest of the country, he distributed lands to his noblemen and assigned specific military quotas to each man. He also required all feudal lords to swear an oath of allegiance to him as king. William the Conqueror preserved the Anglo-Saxon institution of sheriffs, representing the king as at the local level, but replaced the Anglo-Saxon sheriffs with Norman sheriffs rather than Anglo-Saxons. The sheriff had heavy duties. He had to maintain order in the shire. He had to catch criminals and punish them, and he had to collect taxes, and he had to raise an army of foot soldiers. The sheriff also organized all the adult males into groups of 10, with each member liable for good behavior of the others. William thus made the local people responsible for order in the shire. For all his efforts, the sheriff was not to receive any pay, so the system of non-paid government officials was basically reserved for the well-to-do or the local wealthy. In 1086, about 20 years after the initial conquest, William wanted to find out how much everyone had, and also to solidify the boundaries and positions of everyone in his relatively newly conquered kingdom. So he sent around basically tax administrators. They were groups of royal officials who judged every part of the country. In every village and farm, the local priest and 6 local people were put under oath to answer questions of the king's commissioners truthfully. The resulting record was called the Domesday Book, from the Anglo-Saxon word doom, meaning judgment, and this word still survives today. In 1154, Henry II inherited the throne, and he immediately began setting out to increase royal power over England. So he first began to create a unified law system all throughout all of England. And so the decisions of the royal courts became the basis for the English common law that they use even today. These were a legal system based on the customs of the court rulings. Also, in time, these royal courts replaced those of all the noble courts and even that of the church. Henry II created something called common law, a law that was common to and accepted by the entire country. It was made up of local traditions as well as decisions that had been made by the court on previous similar cases. Slowly, the King's Court gained jurisdiction over all cases in regards to property disputes and criminal actions. Henry also improved the procedure of criminal justice, and in 1166 he induced the sheriffs to create local juries to conduct inquests and draw upon lists of known suspects. These lists were created by juries who, under oath, were supposed to present the royal judges with their findings. As an accused person, you were formally charged with a crime, and you did not undergo a trial by jury at this point. You would be tried by ordeal, which was the ancient Germanic format for deciding whether somebody was guilty or innocent. You were tied, usually. A trial by ordeal meant that you were tied hand and foot and often dropped into a lake or a river, because people believed that water was a pure substance and would reject anything foul or unclean. So people who sank were actually considered innocent, and a person who floated was considered guilty. So in this way, God would determine the innocence or guilt of that person, and a priest had to be present in order to bless the water for it to be effective. Well, Henry and the others considered this really barbaric and irrational, and not a very good way of determining the results of whether somebody was innocent or guilty, but they didn't have a good alternative. And the church decided that it was going to step in, and it forbade any of their priests to join in with the trial, and this effectively stopped the trial by ordeal. But gradually, judges began to adopt the trial by jury, which was where you had 12 of your peers who would help decide whether you were innocent or guilty. And this became the trial by jury. Eventually, Henry's attempts to expand royal power got him in trouble with the church. Henry had made one of his good friends the Archbishop of Canterbury. The friend's name was Thomas à Becket. Many, under this type of law system, if a person could prove that he had had some kind of education or training, then he would be considered a cleric and would be able to be tried in a church court. And it was much more beneficial to be tried in a church court than it was in a secular court. The benefits of being a clergy gave the person the right to be tried in a court, and if they were found guilty in a church court, all they had to do were maybe prayers or make a pilgrimage. But if they were tried and found guilty in a secular court, in a court for the king, they could even be mutilated or killed. So the difference would be life-threatening. And Henry II wanted to make everyone, including clerics, subject to his power. But Becket very greatly protested that the church law required clerics to be subject to the church's courts. So this controversy dragged on for years and years, and eventually, in great frustration, Henry II was heard to cry out, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And unfortunately, 4 of his knights heard him say this, and they rode off to Canterbury and caught Thomas in church during the Christmas service, and they killed him in his own cathedral. This was a scandalous incident, and it reflected badly on Henry II. He was forced to back down on his insistence on church courts being banned, and so he eventually had to let them continue, and he also had to do public penance for his, quote, murder of Thomas. Henry's 2 sons, Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionhearted, and John, both lacked their father's interest in working within government. So many of Henry's initial attempts to unify or solidify royal power seem to not have worked. King John was an incompetent soldier and unnecessarily suspicious of the barons who were under him. He always thought that they were plotting against him, and near the end, they definitely were. But he inherited a lot of debt from his father, and then from his brother, whose only passion in life was basically to go on crusade or go to war. So Richard's crusading zeal incurred a lot of debt. And so John spent a lot of his time trying to squeeze the Kingdom of England for all of it was worth, so that he could pay back the debt and also finance his own battle against the King of France, who had effectively reclaimed the area of Normandy that had originally been John's inheritance. John was actually a vassal of the King of France, but it's kind of confusing. So he owned land in France, and that land was he had to pay homage to the King of France in order to maintain the hold on that land. He had inherited that land from both his father and his mother, and so when the King of France called all of his vassals to Paris to pay homage to him, King John wasn't able to come, and so he basically forfeited his land in Normandy. He didn't consider at the time that it would actually happen, that he would lose his land, but the King of France saw it as an ideal opportunity to exercise his feudal right to reclaim the land that he wanted very, very much for his own possession. So John promptly went to war against the King of France. But war is very expensive, and he was already fairly deeply in debt, and so he had to figure out ways to gain money from his own lands in England. He did things that won him no love from his people. For example, he would every time someone was married, he would gain tax from that, and so he would actually force widows to pay exorbitant amounts of money in order to avoid unwanted marriages, noblewomen. And he also he had young girls who were under his he was their like godfather, and he would basically sell them into marriages to the highest bidder. Well, this made the nobility very angry with him. John also alienated the church and the English townspeople. He rejected Pope Innocent III's nominee for the Archbishop of Canterbury, and because he wanted to continue to practice lay investiture. And he also charged townspeople with exorbitant amount. He basically said, either you pay me or you lose the charter of your town. So in all these ways, he started to gain a lot of enemies. But the biggest thing I think that was against him was that he was absolutely rubbish at being a soldier. He was not athletic, and he didn't pretend to be. And he was living in a society where athleticism was the highest value. And so the nobles looked down on him because of his lack of initiative. Eventually, a few of his nobles from the north began a revolt against him, and they were joined by others. And eventually, he had to, after a lot of negotiations with these barons that were under his, were part of his territory, he was forced to sign something called the Magna Carta. Historians point back to the Magna Carta as being the document of all, the grandfather of all documents that legalize freedoms, because this was a document that set up the precedent that everyone is under the law. Even the government, even the king, has to follow the law. The Magna Carta was also the basis for the idea of due process of law, which is also called habeas corpus. And this means that anyone accused of a crime must go through the process of law in order to be found guilty. They can't just be arbitrarily decided by the king or the court that they are guilty. Also, during his negotiations with his fractious barons, he had to agree to several other things that made his power a lot less. He had to agree that he would not raise any new taxes without consulting something called the Great Council, which was a council of lords and clergy, and this council eventually evolved into the English Parliament. In time, Parliament became made up of two houses. You had the House of Lords, which was made up of the noble and the clergy, and then the House of Commons, which was made up of knights and middle-class citizens. The English kings slowly began to have more limited powers. And so even though King John didn't specifically, he knew that when he was signing the Magna Carta that he would not be following through with it. He was simply doing it to get the barons off his back for that moment. But it did set up the precedent that kings will be subject to the people's to law and to the desires of his people. France is quite a different story in its journey towards a unified central government. The first kings that started to unify France in the later Middle Ages, originally it had been unified under Charlemagne, but it had quickly broken up into smaller territories until a king named Hugh Capet came to the throne in 987. Hugh Capet actually means red hat, and this was the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, and it lasted for over 300 years, which says a lot more about the Capetian family's ability to have sons rather than their ability to rule very well. One of the reasons why Hugh Capet and his family were chosen to be the rulers of France was because of their significantly less amount of power to the other French noblemen. So, but Hugh Capet and his successors got down to trying to solidify their power and increasing it, so that by the end of the Capetian dynasty, they were very strongly in control of the territory known as France. One of the ways that the Capetian dynasty was able to administrate such a large territory was that they set up a fairly well-developed bureaucracy that was centralized up at the top, but allowed the individual territories to have a lot of individual freedoms. So the laws and systems of governing remained very much the same as they had before the Capetian dynasty, rather than trying to change everything to be more centralized, like it had been in England. One of the Capetian kings that has been credited with doing the most to unify France under the Capetian rule was a man named Philip Augustus. Philip II, or Philip Augustus. Philip was an extremely sneaky and talented ruler. He is the one who sneakily gained the territory from King John of England, and he also managed to take power away from the nobles in France. And he did this by taking the administrative and judicial power out of the hands of the nobles and using paid middle-class administrators to become government officials within the territories, within each territory. So this made it possible for him to rule almost directly through his governors rather than through the noblemen who would have done things their way rather than his way. During the 1200s, there was an interesting religious revival in southern France. And France has seen southern France was the place for many different religious revivals. And I'm not sure if we can call it a revival, but it had a lot of the group that became known as the Albigensians had many things that we would consider to be very biblical even today. They did have a few strange beliefs, but many of their beliefs were actually based on biblical truth. But this was seen as a heretical movement by the Catholic Church, and so the Catholic Pope, the Pope called upon Philip to try to put down this religious revival, and so he called his nobles, and he himself went out and started hunting down these people known as Albigensians. He was successful in doing this to some extent, but he used this as an excuse to bring southern France into his domains and to more directly in his control. So he always had his eye out for a political maneuvering in order to gain more power for himself. Louis IX, also known as Louis the Pious, ruled from 1226 to 1270. He was famous for his concern for justice. He established a Parliament of Paris, which was kind of a Supreme Court that welcomed the appeals of local administrators and from the courts of feudal lords throughout France. So let's say a person was tried in the court of a feudal lord and did not like the outcome of their trial, or maybe they felt like they didn't receive the justice they deserved, and they could appeal to the royal courts. And so Louis sent also royal judges to all the parts of the country to check up on the work of his officials that he had appointed. They would also hear complaints of injustice, and he was actually the first French monarch to publish a set of laws for his entire kingdom. In these laws, he forbade private warfare and duels or gambling or blasphemy or prostitution. He was very concerned about the morality of his people. And also under his rule, he began the persecution of Jews and heretics and Muslims. He felt that they needed to be brought to the right belief, or that they should be expelled because of their beliefs. He did, however, greatly improve the royal government, and his work expanded the courts and helped to bring justice to France. Louis's grandson, Philip IV, was cut from a completely different cloth. Philip IV was mainly interested in gaining money, and he saw all the lands that the church owned in France, and he resented the fact that they did not pay taxes, and so he spent quite a lot of time and energy trying to force these church lands to pay taxes to the civil government. And this caused the Pope to become very angry and to reprimand Philip IV. So Pope Boniface the Eighth actually declared that God had set popes over kings and kingdoms, and so to tax the lands that were the popes was actually heretical or going against God's will. Eventually, Philip reverted to his usual response to anybody who did not agree with him, and he went and tried to capture Pope Boniface VIII, but Boniface was able to escape, only to die unexpectedly a few days later. And so and Philip IV went even a step farther and decided to try to appoint a pope of his own. And he moved the court from Venice, or from the Vatican, to Avignon, which was a large city in France. And the French pope, was set up there. He set up his court there. This became known as the Great Schism, where there was a pope in the Vatican that was elected by the cardinals, and there was a pope in France that was elected by the French clergy under the leadership of Philip IV. Because Philip IV was such an aggressive king, many people were uncertain about supporting him. And so in order to gain more support from the different echelons of society in France, he started something called the Estates Generales, which was basically a great meeting with the three different categories of people in French society. There were the nobles, the clergy, and the middle class. This group of advisors to the king eventually grew into something slightly similar to the English Parliament, but they never gained the amount of power that the English Parliament had, and that's mainly because the Estates General had no powers to negotiate taxation. The king had complete control over the money, and so he had all the power in the structure. Whereas in England, there was a lot more power in the Parliament because they were the ones who controlled the taxation.